Our platform for accessible remote learning track continues with Dr. Matt Marino, Associate Professor with the University of Central Florida, and Dr. Trey Vasquez, BCBAD, Professor with the University of Central Florida. They'll be talking about infusing UDL in virtual environments.
Hi, and welcome to Infusing Universal Design for Learning in Virtual Environments. My name is Trey Vasquez, and we also have
Matt Marino. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about where students struggle. And this really stems from some work that Trey and I conducted with the National Science Foundation back in 2015. We began a study examining the efficacy of a coaching program for post-secondary students who had learning disabilities and other disabilities such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorders. And what we found was that the students at the post-secondary level who were struggling the most had a primary area of deficit around executive function. Now, this dovetails with the CAS guidelines quite nicely. So if you look at the CAS guidelines as presented here, this is the second iteration of the guidelines. And you keep in mind that you have three principal areas that are interpreted from top to bottom and then horizontally from left to right. You look over at the bottom right, you'll see that executive functions are supported through a number of guidelines under the action and expression principle.
So, what do we want to do in order to infuse UDL instruction as part of the learning process, and especially when we develop video games? First and foremost, we have to establish clear outcomes and goals for each of our learning environments. We want to anticipate learner variability. And so it's important for us to consider what sort of accommodations we need to place within these environments to help make them as accessible as possible. In addition to those things regarding accessibility, we also want to make sure that we're measuring outcomes that are aligned to standards that we are really importantly focused on. For example, the next generation science standards or the mathematics standards. We also want to make sure that the instructional experience is fun, and we try to make sure that we get a lot of feedback from students or our target population as much as possible in order to ensure that the environment is engaging and also fun to play with. And then finally, we want to make sure that we have new understanding that could potentially generalize not just from the game environment, but also into real life environments.
So there were really 10 outcomes from our research working with the post-secondary students. And they told us that the things that were most important to them were these 10 items. A few of them jumped out at us and were quite surprising. So, for example, one of the things that they felt they benefited the most from was a growth mindset. Our coaches used growth mindset strategies with them in order to promote their thinking. So they would go from thinking, I can't do this, to what do I need to do to accomplish this goal? Another piece of this that was particularly interesting was that they were interested in the cognitive reframing, so helping them to rethink the way they were thinking about the process. So when they're working with complex content, they needed to reframe their thinking so that they thought about it from a very logistic perspective, moving from the larger concept to the smaller concepts. And they also wanted humor. So they felt when their coaches were joking with them and having fun, then that was what was most beneficial. That takes us to the gaming aspect. When we design these games for students with varied abilities, we start with a game design document. And from that game design document, we create a detailed map showing what in the game relates to what UDL checkpoint, and then we give a description of that. So this is an example from a game that I co-developed with Filament Games called You Make Me Sick. And in this game, your objective is to make a host whose name is Pudge as sick as possible by customizing a bacteria or viral strain. Now, we provide multiple options for students, by giving them, for example, students who have limited background knowledge can choose from a virus that's already in existence, such as rabies. Whereas students who have advanced knowledge can actually go into the pathogen design studio and develop their own bacteria, for example, a spirochete bacteria.
So what does that look like in a game environment? So this is a snapshot of one of the games Matt and I helped create with Language Express. And the goal is to provide players with a day in the life experience of a STEM career job. So this is obviously geared towards transition students. And what we have here in this user interface are some of the accommodations and some of the tools that we put in place, such as a career mentor at the bottom of the screen here to provide feedback on performance. We also have closed captioning, voice to text, etc. If you go down to the settings in the upper right-hand corner, you can actually customize what those settings would be per student, and that would allow you to have individualized experiences for each of these environments, and they will carry over across different virtual platforms in terms of the gameplay itself. So what do students tell us? Students have reported to us, and we have a data set of over 5,000 students, in where they are particularly much more interested in playing simulations and virtual serious games because to learn about science and mathematics and other STEM content area because it's more fun. They like the ability to collaborate within the game and across classroom conversations. They actually said that they would rather play video games and simulations than take traditional paper-based tests. Now, this is a critical piece because one of the things that we've seen in our prior research is that we will have a student who goes through the video game and can demonstrate all of the critical components of a particular task and content knowledge. But then when they transfer back to a paper-based test to take the same content knowledge test, they fail to demonstrate the same level of knowledge. So somewhere there's a disconnect between the virtual environment and the traditional paper-based tests that are not sensitive enough to pick those up. And that's where some of the future research that Matt and I are really interested in.
And what this gameplay allows us to do is transfer what's happening on the student's screen and the objectives that they're either achieving or not achieving, and transmit that to the teachers so that they can provide detailed feedback with the students immediately following gameplay or during gameplay. The teachers told us that when they were using the games in their classrooms, they actually led to unanticipated discussions, which we were thrilled about because it shows that the students were engaged with the content, and they'd often jump up and say, "Hey, look what I found here," to their colleagues sitting next to them. We also include in the game a number of instructional supports. But what was particularly interesting is this expert modeling tool that we've included, where if the student is struggling, a virtual mentor will pop up and provide them with suggestions about how they may want to progress in the game. We also provide them with immediate corrective feedback so that we don't have them promulgating these misconceptions, which can often happen in middle school and high school. The final piece we wanted to discuss was that the games actually address challenges with traditional assessment. So, as many people know, the state assessments that we had scheduled for this year for most of our students were canceled. And as a result, we need another means to assess their knowledge. So, game-based learning allows us to connect students' performance in the game to specific standards that they're accomplishing in the game-based learning environment. Now, teachers told us that games and assessment were actually more appropriate because they would have students in their classes who were scoring low on the paper and pencil test. And if you think about this, it just makes sense. You have a student who's a middle school student working with cellular organelles, and they have mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, etc. Very difficult for students with dyslexia. In the game-based environment, it simplifies that and allows you to understand what the students know about the function of those cell organelles.
Last slide before we have to close for the day. Here are some of the current challenges and future research directions that Matt and I are headed towards. And with that, we want to say thank you, and we will take questions through the unconference system.
Thank you.